For weeks, the numbers had lined up neatly, reassuringly, exactly as orbital dynamics predicted they should. The object known as 3I divided by Atlas, classified as only the third interstellar visitor ever identified, had been tracked with quiet precision as it glided into the solar system. Its path seemed clear, a smooth arc determined by nothing more than gravity's impartial hand. Yet on that late-night shift in Pasadena, a junior analyst noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The latest positional data was off. Not much, not enough to alarm an outsider, but to someone who lived and breathed in the cold mathematics of trajectories, the discrepancy was unmistakable. A fraction of a degree, but a fraction that mattered. It meant that the universe's simplest equation, an object in motion staying in motion, was suddenly broken. At first, they assumed a measurement error. Interstellar rocks did not alter their own courses, after all, and Atlas had shown no sign of activity, no gas jets or dust trails that might mimic a comet's unpredictable spurts. Yet as hours passed and more stations checked their feeds, the error stubbornly persisted. Each new data point confirmed what the last had hinted. Atlas had shifted, nudged itself in a way that did not belong to chance. The motion was too clean, too deliberate, not the chaotic twitch of a tumbling boulder, but the smooth correction of something guided. In the control center, conversations fell into a strained hush. The digital map projected on the wall no longer showed a single unbroken line but a deviation, a branching arc like a scar across their model of space. Engineers leaned close to their monitors, fingers flicking nervously across keyboards, rerunning code they knew had no bugs, convincing themselves that somewhere, somehow, human error had slipped in. Yet the truth refused to yield to denial. It was not them, it was the object. Atlas was not supposed to be like this. It had been hailed as a scientific prize when first catalogued, a chance to sample the chemistry of distant star systems, to watch an emissary of the galaxy drift past the sun's influence. But now its sudden shift turned it from curiosity to enigma. If natural, it would upend models of interstellar debris, forcing scientists to account for some invisible mechanism. If unnatural, the implications were more profound, far heavier than anyone dared to articulate aloud. The room held the silence of people standing at the edge of a realization too large to fit comfortably in thought. In the following hours, teams across NASA and beyond were looped in, their encrypted networks alive with hurried updates and raw data streams. The reports all matched. What had been predicted as a stately passage would now miss its projected track by millions of kilometers. Some called it a fluke of solar radiation pressure, a push from photons stronger than expected. But those who ran the equations dismissed it. The numbers did not bend that way. Whatever had touched Atlas had not been the Sunday. At dawn, as Los Angeles brightened under a pale morning sky, the object was already receding deeper into the system, its trajectory now permanently altered. The world outside remained unaware, but inside the halls of space science, a quiet storm had begun. Atlas, the visitor from another star, had just defied the universe's oldest rule, and no one could yet say how or why. The conference room at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory was designed for clarity and calm, neutral colors, bright screens, and rows of ergonomic chairs, where scientists and engineers could focus on data without distraction. Yet on this night, it felt more like a bunker than a meeting space. The blinds were drawn, the doors guarded by security staff who had been instructed to admit no one without clearance, and the screens glowed with the faint, unsettling curve of a trajectory that should not exist. The hum of servers filled the silence between bursts of clipped voices. Men and women leaned forward in their seats, their faces pale in the cold light, each reluctant to be the first to say what everyone was thinking. At the center of the room stood Dr. Elena Marquez, a veteran orbital dynamicist whose calm had steered teams through countless mission anomalies. She had dealt with spacecraft that lost signals, rovers that froze on alien planes, satellites that spun out of control. But this was different. This was no machine of theirs misbehaving. This was something no one had ever claimed ownership of, and yet it moved as if it answered to a command. She pointed at the line on the screen, the faint kink where the object's new path diverged from the predicted arc. Her voice was low, steady, but laced with urgency. "We've confirmed with Canberra, Madrid, and Goldstone. It's not an artifact. This deviation is real." Around her, whispers rose and fell. Some clung to natural explanations. Perhaps a volatile patch of ice had sublimated unexpectedly, like a comet giving off a sudden jet. But the object had shown no coma, no tail, no evidence of being anything but inert rock and metal. Others muttered about solar winds or radiation pressure, though the force required to make such a clean correction was far beyond what sunlight alone could deliver. No explanation fit. The atmosphere was tense, like a courtroom where an unspeakable verdict loomed. People avoided each other's eyes, afraid of voicing aloud the word that hovered, unspoken, over every workstation: artificial. To suggest it openly felt dangerous, reckless, even career-ending. So instead, they buried themselves in equations, comparing measurements, double-checking Doppler shifts, running orbital mechanics, until the models all agreed with the same uncomfortable conclusion. The director of the Deep Space Network, joined by secure video link, his face shadowed, the signal grainy. He reported faint irregularities in the radio reflections, the kind of noise that shouldn't have structure, and yet repeated with a rhythm that could not be dismissed as random. "We're still cleaning the signal," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "But something is there, something not consistent with background." The words sent a ripple through the room, a collective tightening of throats. Behind closed doors, the discussion grew sharper, more urgent. Some argued for immediate disclosure, that science must remain transparent, that the public had a right to know. Others countered that premature statements could ignite hysteria or be twisted into conspiracy fuel. NASA, they reminded each other, had weathered storms of speculation before every blurry UFO photograph, every odd transmission interpreted as alien, every rumor that spiraled beyond control. They could not afford another frenzy, not when the data itself was still raw. So the war room settled into a strained compromise. The official line would remain calm, dismissive even, until the numbers hardened into something undeniable. Teams would work in shifts, refining their models, cross-checking with international observatories, searching for a natural cause they could defend publicly. Yet beneath the polished words of restraint, the mood was different. It was the mood of people staring at a locked door in the mind and realizing, with dawning unease, that something was knocking on the other side. By the time the sun set over California again, the shift from disbelief to grim acceptance was complete. The data had been checked, recalibrated, and verified against independent sources, and still the conclusion refused to bend. 3, I divided by Atlas, had changed course in a way that natural forces could not explain. Every new plot on the screens added weight to the same unsettling story, the line of its trajectory bending with a precision that mocked the stubborn denial still clinging to some of the room's veterans. They had seen asteroids tumble, comets outgas unpredictably, meteoroids fracture under thermal stress. This was not that. The path of Atlas carried the unmistakable fingerprint of intention. Teams of analysts now worked around the clock, their eyes burning from too many hours staring at orbital mechanics software, watching the deviation magnify with each new input. At first, the shift had seemed minor, almost negligible in cosmic terms, but the more they projected forward, the more alarming it became. Atlas was no longer on the stately exit track they had charted. Instead, its course angled subtly inward, threading it deeper into the system, a path that would carry it closer to Earth's orbital neighborhood than anyone had anticipated. The jitter was not chaotic, it was surgical. Dr. Marquez leaned over one console where simulations played out in accelerated time, showing the object's past and potential futures. "Look at this," she said quietly to a colleague, tapping the screen. The old model traced a graceful arc out of the solar system, a farewell wave to the planets. The new one veered slightly, a barely perceptible correction that cascaded into a vast divergence. Millions of kilometers separated the two paths after only a few months. The kind of correction a spacecraft might make to tighten an approach, but that was impossible, wasn't it? The thought hung unspoken in the air, gnawing at the rational frameworks of the scientists. Their training had prepared them to expect the unexpected, to find hidden variables, to explain anomalies with patience, yet here the anomaly did not dissolve under scrutiny, it sharpened, as though the more they studied it, the more deliberate it became. In Washington, defense liaisons were quietly looped into the chain of communication. Their questions were blunt, stripped of scientific hedging. Could this be a threat? Was it maneuvering? Was it heading toward Earth? NASA's answers were careful but unsatisfying. The trajectory was still within the bounds of a pass, not a collision, but the object's behavior defied known natural forces. That alone was enough to ignite military imaginations. Behind the scientists' guarded words, The Pentagon saw a specter of reconnaissance, of alien surveillance, of something probing Earth with chilling detachment. The technical teams tried to ground themselves in the familiar, clinging to the language of mechanics. They examined the possibility of a jet of outgassing ice hidden in the object's dark surface, even though spectral data suggested nothing volatile. They tested the influence of solar radiation pressure again, though the object's mass-to-area ratio made such an effect trivial. They calculated gravitational tugs from unseen companions, but the void around Atlas was empty. Every option ended in dead ends. Some of the younger analysts whispered comparisons to the long-debated case of Oumuamua, the first interstellar object discovered decades earlier, which had also exhibited a strange, unexplained acceleration. Back then, the anomaly had been dismissed by most as a quirk of cometary activity, but now, with Atlas repeating the riddle and doing so with a cleaner, more unsettling correction, those old doubts returned like ghosts. Had they ignored the first warning because it was easier than facing the possibility? Night after night, the screens flickered with new plots, and the phrase trajectory jitters became an uneasy shorthand among the teams. But everyone knew that what they were seeing was no jitter, no random shake of physics. It was motion with purpose, small in magnitude but colossal in implication. And with each passing day, Atlas drew closer to the point where its intentions, if such a word could even apply, might be revealed. The Deep Space Network had always been a quiet sentinel, listening patiently across the vastness, its giant dishes rising from deserts and valleys like white lilies angled toward the stars. For decades, those antennas had carried the faint voices of distant probes back home. Voyager's fading whispers, Cassini's final transmission, Perseverance's daily updates from the Martian dust. But now the network was listening to something it had never expected, an interstellar traveler that seemed to move as though it bore intent. At Goldstone, the California facility, nestled among barren hills, a signal analyst named Victor Tran leaned over a console, his headphones pressing tight against his ears. What he heard was not a voice exactly, nor even a transmission in the normal sense. It was the echo of radar pings bouncing off 3i divided by Atlas, returned faint and delayed, the raw fingerprint of its shape and surface. Usually, such echoes were nothing more than static washed over, with predictable scatter, patterns that could be modeled by the object's tumbling geometry. But this time there was something else. Tiny fluctuations, rhythmic spikes just above the noise floor, patterns that stubbornly repeated when they should have been random. Victor flagged the anomaly, expecting his supervisor to brush it aside. Yet when she leaned in to listen, her expression darkened. They compared the signals to baselines, ran Fourier analyses, checked against interference from terrestrial sources. The rhythm held. When they cross-referenced with data from Canberra and Madrid, the pattern was there too, faint but consistent across half the globe. Whatever Atlas was doing, it was leaving behind whispers modulations in the returned radar that defied the usual chaos of bouncing signals. Engineers debated furiously. Was it surface resonance, the way irregular structures might scatter radar like a drum? Was it coincidence born of noisy electronics? Yet the more they filtered, the more the whispers seemed to crystallize into something structured, a rhythm too steady to dismiss, pulses that seemed to come in sequences rather than in random bursts. Reports were forwarded to the secure lines connecting DSN to JPL and NASA headquarters. The language was cautious. Phrases like non-random scatter and unexpected echo modulation were chosen carefully, as if neutrality could shield the analysts from the implications. Still, the tone could not hide the growing unease. Machines did not whisper. Rocks did not reflect radar in repeating patterns. Only something with internal structure, something perhaps designed, could produce such echoes. Inside the war rooms, the data was replayed over and over, the sequences stretched out visually into waveforms, the patterns glowing on screens. A few dared to suggest it resembled coded information, though none could decipher meaning. Others urged restraint, pointing out that nature often wore the mask of order where none was intended. Yet the parallel was impossible to ignore. The Deep Space Network, built to cradle humanity's own robotic explorers across the void, now seemed to be brushing against a signal from an outsider, as though two listening posts had stumbled upon each other in the dark. The whispers became the subject of hushed conversations in hallways and late-night messages on encrypted threads. No one outside the walls of NASA knew, not yet. But inside the network of those who had heard the echoes, there was a shared sensation that history had tilted. if only by a fraction of a degree. For decades, they had sent signals outward, hoping for a reply. Now, in the faint rhythm of radar pings returned from a nameless interstellar traveler, it felt as though the silence had finally cracked. The first memo was never meant to leave the corridors of NASA. It was a short document, stamped with the familiar internal use only watermark, and phrased in the restrained language of technical caution. It outlined the trajectory deviation of 3I divided by Atlas, acknowledged that known natural forces could not account for the change, and noted the Deep Space Network's unexpected echo modulations. There were no bold claims, no sensational words, only careful phrasing designed to contain panic. And yet, even in its clinical tone, the implications seeped through like water through a crack. The object had moved in a way that should not be possible. Within hours of being circulated among a limited group of engineers and administrators, the memo began to drift. A forwarded email to a colleague outside the initial distribution, a hard copy forgotten on a desk, a whispered summary over an unsecured line. The pathways of human curiosity and fear are never perfectly sealed. By the end of the week, the memo had surfaced in the inbox of a science journalist known for cultivating sources inside federal agencies. It arrived as a grainy scan, the watermark faint but still visible, the sentences clipped mid-line, as though the sender had photographed it hastily. The journalist read it once, twice, a third time, his pulse quickening. He had covered space for years, budget overruns, rocket launches, planetary discoveries, but this was different. This was the kind of story that could ignite the world if handled carelessly, or destroy reputations if revealed prematurely. He verified the formatting, the phrasing, compared it to past NASA memoranda he had obtained. It felt authentic, and its cautious words carried a weight that needed no embellishment. Within NASA, the leak was noticed almost immediately. Security officers began combing through access logs, narrowing down who had viewed the document. Meetings turned heated as administrators argued over how to respond. Some urged transparency, better to release a controlled statement than let rumors spread unchecked. Others insisted on silence, fearing that public disclosure would spiral into hysteria before the data was fully understood. The very act of secrecy, however, made the leak all the more combustible. As days passed, more fragments escaped, email chains debating the cause of the anomaly, snippets of signal analysis suggesting repeating radar patterns, even a rough plot of the altered trajectory. Each piece was incomplete, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. NASA, it seemed, was facing a mystery it could not explain, and doing its best to contain the fallout. The memos soon found their way into the darker corners of the internet, where speculation thrives. Forums lit up with threads dissecting every phrase, every numerical reference, every hint of withheld knowledge. Amateur astronomers compared their own observations, some confirming slight deviations in the object's position, others dismissing it as hysteria. Conspiracy theorists seized the moment, spinning tales of cover-ups and secret contact. And through it all, the original documents circulated like forbidden texts, their plain language paradoxically more convincing than any sensational claim. Inside NASA, the mood soured. The leak had forced their hand, yet still they resisted going public. Engineers continued their work in a fog of mistrust, unsure who among them had broken ranks. The secure war rooms grew colder, the conversations sharper, as if the very act of secrecy had turned colleagues into potential suspects. And above them all, the object itself glided silently on its new path, indifferent to the storm of words it had sparked on Earth. The memoranda had been written to downplay fear, to preserve calm. Instead, once released, they became accelerants, feeding the fire of curiosity and suspicion. What had begun as a whisper in the Deep Space Network was now spreading into the world beyond, and no amount of cautious phrasing could pull it back into silence. Officially, nothing was wrong. The public-facing channels of NASA remained steady, calm, and precise, releasing their routine bulletins about solar weather, updates on Artemis timelines, and celebratory images from Mars rovers. There were no statements about 3I divided by Atlas, no acknowledgement of leaked memoranda or radar whispers, nothing to suggest that the agency was grappling with an anomaly of historic proportions. For the outside world, silence reigned, but inside the offices, labs, and secured networks of NASA and its partner agencies, the reality was anything but calm. In the days after the leaks, a palpable strain stretched across the organization. Engineers who had once greeted each other warmly in hallways now passed with curt nods, their conversations clipped, every glance laced with suspicion. Some believed the leak had been an act of reckless betrayal, undermining their ability to control the narrative and exposing delicate work to premature ridicule. Others quietly applauded it, seeing in the breach the only way to force transparency in a system too accustomed to secrecy. Either way, the damage was done. The world was beginning to ask questions NASA had no safe answers for. Behind closed doors, debates grew fierce. One faction, cautious, conservative, insisted on natural explanations. They pointed to comets and asteroids that had once baffled scientists before later yielding to logical causes. A jet of sublimated ice could still not be ruled out entirely, they argued, even if the object's spectra showed little sign of volatiles. Sunlight could impart subtle forces. Irregular shapes could twist trajectories in ways hard to model. To leap toward extraordinary explanations was to abandon the discipline of science itself. The opposing faction was smaller but more vocal. They reminded their colleagues of Oumuamua, the first interstellar object, whose unexplained acceleration had never been conclusively solved. They asked why Atlas seemed to correct its course so smoothly, with a precision more akin to guidance than to chance. And then there were the deep space network whispers, the strange radar echoes, rhythmic and repeating, which no model of surface scattering could fully explain. If these were natural quirks, why did they so perfectly mimic intention? Supervisors tried to contain the arguments, but the turmoil seeped outward. International partners had begun to notice the silence too. The European Southern Observatory, Japan's JAXA, even amateur skywatchers armed with powerful telescopes were detecting the deviation, publishing plots that aligned uncomfortably well with the leaked documents. The mystery was no longer NASA's alone, and yet NASA was expected to lead, to explain, to reassure. Instead, the agency found itself paralyzed, trapped between the risk of fueling hysteria and the greater risk of being caught in denial. Meetings stretched late into the night, voices fraying with exhaustion. Draft press releases were written, edited, scrapped. Each one stumbled over the same problem. How do you tell the world that something in the sky has defied explanation without inviting the word alien to dominate every headline? The very act of withholding, however, only sharpened speculation. Journalists, bloggers, and self-styled investigators seized on the silence as proof of conspiracy. The more NASA said nothing, the louder the world filled in the blanks. For the scientists themselves, the turmoil was deeply personal. Many had devoted their lives to rational explanations, to peeling back the mysteries of the cosmos with patience and rigor. To stand on the brink of an anomaly that whispered of intelligence beyond Earth was both thrilling and terrifying, a collision of awe and dread that kept them awake at night. Some stared at the trajectory plots on their screens long after their shifts ended, caught in a private war between disbelief and wonder. So the silence persisted, carefully maintained for the public eye, while behind it private turmoil raged unchecked. The halls of NASA had become a stage of whispered arguments, hidden fear, and fragile hope, all orbiting around an object that continued to glide silently through the heavens, rewriting the rules with every kilometer it traveled. To understand the enigma of 3I divided by Atlas, astronomers turned back to its very beginning, those first uncertain nights, when its faint light was recorded against the black of space. The discovery itself had been quiet, almost unremarkable at the time, logged in March of that year by a survey telescope scanning for near-Earth objects. A dim streak across a CCD frame, faint enough that it might have been overlooked if not for the diligence of an automated detection algorithm. At first, it seemed like any other distant interloper, a cometary fragment slipping into the gravitational reach of the Sunday. But as additional observations poured in, it quickly became clear that Atlas was something stranger. Its velocity and incoming angle marked it as interstellar, a traveler from far beyond the reach of our star. Back then, scientists had greeted the discovery with excitement, but not alarm. It was, after all, only the third such object ever observed, following in the footsteps of Oumuamua and Borisov. A rare prize, yes, but not an impossibility. Its orbit was calculated, its surface brightness measured, its trajectory charted. There were notes of curiosity, the way its albedo shifted oddly under different wavelengths, the faint irregularities in its spin state. But these quirks were catalogued and filed away as minor curiosities, nothing worth derailing the thrill of simply catching another visitor from the stars. Now, with Atlas altering its course in defiance of natural law, those early quirks returned under a harsher light. Spectral data, once dismissed as noisy, revealed inconsistencies in reflectivity that seemed less like the randomness of a rugged surface and more like panels or facets designed to scatter light in peculiar ways. Its spin state, once thought to be tumbling chaotically, now appeared more stable, as if controlled. Even its brightness curve, plotted carefully by patient graduate students, carried hints of modulation, subtle patterns that looked suspiciously like flashing, repeating intervals rather than the scatter of inert rock. In observatories across the world, researchers pulled up archived frames, scrubbing through the raw data with new eyes. Had they missed the signs? Had they been so eager to fit Atlas into familiar categories that they had overlooked evidence of something unprecedented? The thought was sobering. Science prided itself on skepticism, on caution. But skepticism could also blind. If Atlas had always been more than it appeared, then humanity's first close look at interstellar technology had already slipped past, disguised as a rock. International collaboration intensified. Teams from Chile, Hawaii, the Canary Islands, and Mauna Kea shared data sets, layering their observations into a composite that traced Atlas from its first recorded glimmer to its present deviation. The deeper they dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. Surface coloration that shifted unnaturally between exposures, a thermal signature that implied unexpected heat retention. Even minor accelerations, brushed aside as measurement noise in the early weeks, now seemed like precursors to the larger course correction that had shocked the world. And then came the most unsettling realization: the object's origin vector. Astronomers traced Atlas backward, running simulations that wound its path into the past. Unlike Borisov, which had arrived from the galactic disk, or Oumuamua, whose origins were murkier, Atlas seemed to hail from a specific direction, a corridor of space not far, astronomically speaking, from a nearby star system. The margin of error was vast, and no one dared proclaim certainty, but the vector pointed roughly toward the vicinity of Lyra, a region famous for one thing in particular: Vega, a star long romanticized in human imagination and featured in countless stories of contact. The irony was not lost on the scientists, though most refused to entertain the connection openly. The origins of Atlas were suddenly not just about where it had come from, but what it had always been. The faint peculiarities once dismissed as quirks now loomed large, pieces of a puzzle that seemed to spell a single, uncomfortable conclusion. If it had shifted course now, perhaps it had always been capable of doing so. Perhaps its journey across the stars had never been passive. Perhaps, from the very beginning, 3I divided by Atlas had been watching. By the time Atlas's deviation could no longer be brushed aside as miscalculation, other nations had already begun turning their instruments toward it. Europe's observatories, always quick to pursue interstellar oddities, brought their largest mirrors into play. The Very Large Telescope in Chile, with its adaptive optics, delivered sharp images that confirmed what NASA's analysts feared. The object's trajectory was no longer consistent with a simple gravitational pass. Across the globe, Japan's Subaru telescope on Mauna Kea, China's fast radio dish, and India's GMRT all joined the chase. Data poured in from every continent, and everywhere it told the same story. This was no measurement error. Atlas had shifted deliberately, and its altered path could be seen by anyone with the equipment to measure. NASA had lost control of the narrative. For a brief moment, it had tried to downplay the anomaly, hoping to buy time, to craft a careful explanation. But science was not so easily contained. Independent astronomers, some working from university observatories, others from backyard setups equipped with high-precision CCD rigs, were logging their own measurements. They plotted the object's position against the predicted ephemerides, and their graphs spread quickly through online forums and preprint archives. The deviation was real, observable by anyone who cared to look. NASA's silence only made its refusal more conspicuous. In Europe, the reaction was markedly different. The European Space Agency, though cautious, issued a statement acknowledging the anomaly, calling it an intriguing opportunity for international scientific study. It was a carefully chosen phrase, but it broke the silence that NASA had fought to maintain. Suddenly, the matter was no longer an American problem, it was a global mystery. Japan followed with its own quiet acknowledgement, while Chinese scientists, more direct, spoke openly in press conferences about the possibility of non-natural influences. Each statement widened the circle of speculation, each data release a nail in the coffin of secrecy. For the scientists themselves, national boundaries meant little. Behind the scenes, encrypted collaborations sprang up between research teams scattered across the world. Data sets were compared, instruments cross-calibrated, methods scrutinized. The more eyes turned to Atlas, the clearer the picture became. Its brightness curve continued to fluctuate with odd regularity. Its radar echoes retained that faint rhythmic modulation, and its motion could not be reconciled with the forces of nature alone. In the quiet corridors of these collaborations, words once unthinkable began to slip into conversation. Artificial, engineered, intentional. Public reaction followed swiftly. Amateur astronomers streamed live feeds of their telescopes onto the internet, capturing Atlas's faint glimmer as it crept across starfields. Online communities buzzed with speculation, their members dissecting official plots and overlaying them with their own. Some claimed to see flashes of light in the time-lapse exposures, arguing that Atlas was signaling, while others dismissed such claims as artifacts of overexposed pixels. Yet even the skeptics could not deny the growing body of evidence that something unprecedented was happening. Inside NASA, the pressure mounted. Scientists who had once begged for time now found themselves fielding questions from international colleagues, their silence eroding their credibility. Leaked emails hinted at internal frustration, some accusing leadership of cowardice, others warning that by refusing to speak, the agency was losing its role as the world's scientific authority. The turmoil within the United States was now mirrored by voices abroad, all insisting on one truth. This was no longer a matter that could be hidden. The eyes of Earth were now united, however reluctantly, on a single point of light drifting across the heavens. Atlas had become a mirror, in which humanity saw its divisions and its common fears reflected. The object itself remained silent, gliding on its mysterious course, but by shifting ever so slightly, it had forced the planet beneath it to awaken to a possibility long imagined and long denied. The silence of the cosmos was cracking, and it was no longer possible for one nation alone to decide what that meant. It began quietly, as all dangerous ideas do. In secure video calls and restricted chat channels, a handful of scientists dared to voice the words that had haunted their thoughts since the deviation was first confirmed. They spoke it in careful tones, hedged with disclaimers, their sentences weighted with qualifiers, if, perhaps, hypothetically. And yet, the essence was the same. What if 3I divided by Atlas was not a rock at all? What if it was a machine, a probe, something crafted rather than born? For weeks, their colleagues resisted. Science thrives on skepticism, and the suggestion of alien technology risked tarnishing entire careers. It was easier to cling to natural explanations, however stretched they had become. But as more data arrived, the repeating radar echoes, the precise course correction, the peculiar surface reflectivity, the alternative grew harder to dismiss. Slowly, the words artificial origin began to appear in internal memos, never as a conclusion, always as one possibility among many. Yet their very presence marked a shift. The unimaginable had become discussable. Dr. Elena Marquez, who had once been the steady anchor of orbital analysis, now found herself leading hushed conversations in dim-lit offices. "We cannot dismiss it simply because it frightens us," she told her team, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "If it moves as if guided, if it scatters signals as though structured, then we must at least entertain the idea that it is what it appears to be." She stopped short of calling it a spacecraft, but the implication lingered. Across the ocean, European astronomers were less hesitant. Freed from some of the political weight pressing on their American counterparts, they began to publish cautiously worded papers in preprint archives. They did not declare alien technology outright, but they laid the groundwork, pointing out that the data could not be reconciled with known natural processes, that non-gravitational influences of unknown origin were shaping Atlas's path. Between the lines, the message was clear. The hypothesis spread beyond the scientific community, leaping into the media with the speed of wildfire. A single leaked paragraph, stripped of context, made its way into a major newspaper. "Artificial propulsion cannot be excluded." The phrase was enough. Overnight, headlines screamed of alien craft in the solar system, of NASA cover-ups, of historic contact. Television pundits debated the credibility of the claim, some dismissing it as hysteria, others warning that the world had just crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Behind the noise, the scientists pressed on. They knew the risks of being misunderstood, but they also knew that the truth, however unsettling, demanded pursuit. If Atlas was artificial, then its trajectory correction was not a quirk, but a message, a demonstration of control, a sign that something was watching, choosing, perhaps even testing. And if so, then humanity was no longer alone in the galaxy, no longer the sole author of its cosmic story. The alien hypothesis was still just that, a hypothesis, but it had broken the dam of denial. What had once been unspeakable was now the subject of official meetings, of public speculation, of quiet, fearful prayers. For some, it was exhilarating, proof that humanity's dreams of company in the stars were not in vain. For others, it was terrifying, evidence that Earth had already been found, and by something capable of slipping into the solar system unnoticed. And through it all, Atlas remained silent. It neither flashed nor broadcast, neither confirmed nor denied. It simply moved, calmly, deliberately, as though indifferent to the storm it had unleashed below. Yet in its silence, it had forced humanity to confront its oldest and most unsettling question. If we are not alone, what is it that shares the galaxy with us? For many of the scientists now caught in the maelstrom of 3I divided by Atlas, the current debates carried a haunting familiarity. Just a generation earlier, the astronomical community had lived through the controversy of the first interstellar object ever discovered, 1I, Oumuamua. It had slipped into the solar system unexpectedly, a strange shard of something from another star, first noticed only after it was already leaving. Its trajectory had raised eyebrows then, too. It had accelerated ever so slightly as it departed, in a manner inconsistent with pure gravity. The mainstream explanation had been outgassing, though Oumuamua had shown no visible coma, no tail, nothing to suggest it behaved like a comet. Still, scientists preferred the safety of natural causes, even when those causes strained plausibility. But not everyone had been satisfied. A small number of researchers, most notably Harvard's Avi Loeb, had suggested that Oumuamua might have been artificial, perhaps a fragment of alien technology, a light sail pushed by starlight, or even a probe. At the time, the hypothesis had been widely criticized, dismissed as sensationalism, its proponents accused of undermining science with speculation. Careers had been bruised, reputations scuffed. In the end, Oumuamua slipped away, unmeasured and unresolved, and the mainstream consensus quietly settled back into the comfort of uncertainty, preferring a poor natural explanation to the discomfort of the alien alternative. Now, years later, with 3I divided by Atlas performing its impossible maneuver, the echoes of that earlier debate returned with a vengeance. "We've been here before," muttered one researcher at JPL, staring at the overlay of trajectories, and we looked away. The similarities were undeniable. An interstellar visitor, a subtle but precise deviation from expected motion, and a lack of obvious natural mechanisms to explain it. The difference was that this time, the anomaly was sharper, clearer, harder to bury under the language of comets and outgassing. Old papers on Oumuamua resurfaced, downloaded in droves, their citations spiking as scientists revisited arguments they had once dismissed. In conference calls, younger astronomers confessed that their professors had taught them to treat the alien hypothesis as fringe, not because the evidence was weak, but because the stigma was strong. Now, with Atlas's behavior unfolding in real time, they wondered if history had been unkind to those who had dared to ask the forbidden question. Perhaps Loeb had not been wrong, only early. The media, too, seized on the parallels. Documentaries re-aired old footage of Oumuamua's discovery, splicing it with fresh commentary about Atlas. Headlines declared, "The mystery returns," "Déjà vu from the stars," and "What we ignored the first time." Public memory, always fickle, was suddenly jolted awake. Many who had barely registered the debates of the past now demanded answers, pointing to the uncanny repetition as proof that something extraordinary was happening. Inside NASA, the comparison cut deeper. Administrators knew that their handling of Oumuamua, downplaying anomalies, defaulting to safe explanations, had shielded them from controversy, but also left them unprepared for this moment. Now, the same strategy seemed impossible. Atlas was not slipping silently out of the system, beyond the reach of instruments. It was here, altering its path in ways that the entire world could measure. The past could not be repeated. And yet, The shadow of Oumuamua lingered in every meeting, a reminder of the price of speaking too boldly or too soon. Some feared repeating the reputational wounds of those who had dared to whisper alien last time. Others argued that silence had cost them credibility, and that refusing to acknowledge the echoes would look like willful blindness. It was a damned if you do, damned if you don't dilemma, one that left leadership paralyzed, the weight of history pressing down on every choice. For those who had followed Oumuamua closely, Atlas felt like a second chance, a cosmic echo, offering humanity an opportunity to confront its fear of the unknown honestly, without burying it under weak natural explanations. But whether humanity was ready to accept that echo, or doomed to repeat its denial, remained an open question. The skies had given them another messenger, and this time its voice was louder. The more the Deep Space Network and its international counterparts focused on Atlas, the more troubling the data became. What had first been dismissed as radar noise now revealed subtle structures, faint rhythmic pulses that refused to fade under statistical analysis. At first, scientists hesitated to call them signals. They used euphemisms, structured anomalies, non-random scatter phrases that preserved the veneer of neutrality. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The patterns repeated, not with the chaotic irregularity of natural resonance, but with intervals that looked designed. The listening problem was born from this realization. Radio astronomers had long dreamed of detecting alien transmissions, but they had also built entire frameworks of caution around the dangers of misinterpretation. Nature is a master of mimicry. Pulsars were once called LGM, little green men, before being understood as neutron stars. Quasars, too, had briefly been considered candidates for intelligent origin. The lesson had been seared into the discipline. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And so, even as the pulses from Atlas grew clearer, the scientists fought against their own eyes, terrified of falling into the trap of anthropocentric projection. But the problem deepened when multiple facilities, separated by continents, confirmed the same rhythms. Goldstone in California, Madrid in Spain, Canberra in Australia, all reported echoes that matched in timing, down to fractions of a second. When plotted side by side, the sequences aligned like bars of sheet music. No terrestrial interference could explain the global consistency, and so the whispers grew louder, not just in the data but in the minds of those who analyzed it. The true dilemma was not in the hearing but in the meaning. Were these pulses accidental artifacts of some alien material, the way a structured surface might scatter radar into repeating forms, or were they intentional, an encoded reply, a faint acknowledgement that the object knew it was being watched? The thought unsettled even the most disciplined researchers. If the latter were true, then Atlas was not just drifting through the solar system. It was aware. Within closed meetings, theorists sketched scenarios on whiteboards. Could a probe, designed to survive interstellar travel, be passively powered by sunlight or cosmic rays, its surfaces doubling as a communication grid? Could the faint modulations be bleed-through from some dormant system, never meant for us at all? The possibilities multiplied, each more staggering than the last. Yet for all the speculation, one obstacle remained. Humanity was unprepared to decode such a signal, if signal it was. Our SETI programs had always been designed to listen for intentional broadcasts, clear, narrowband transmissions sent across the stars. But Atlas's whispers were tangled within radar reflections, muddy and ambiguous. If it was speaking, it was doing so in a dialect far beyond our current capacity to translate. We could listen, yes, but could we truly hear? The debate fractured into camps. Some argued that the patterns were noise until proven otherwise, that human minds were too eager to see intelligence in chaos. Others insisted that the evidence had crossed the threshold, repeating structure equals design. A third, quieter group raised a more chilling possibility that the pulses were not intended for us at all. Perhaps they were responses meant for something else. A dialogue we had stumbled upon accidentally, like eavesdroppers catching half of a coded exchange. The listening problem was more than a technical challenge. It was a philosophical one. For decades, humanity had sent its own messages into the void, confident that if we ever received a reply, we would recognize it instantly. Now, faced with the possibility that such a reply had arrived in the most ambiguous form imaginable, scientists were forced to confront the limits of their own assumptions. Recognition was not guaranteed, understanding was not inevitable, and perhaps, just perhaps, Atlas was not trying to be understood at all. It was inevitable that, once the possibility of intelligence was raised, the conversations turned dark. The Pentagon had already taken a seat at the table, its representatives less concerned with spectral graphs or orbital mechanics than with what the object meant. The scientists argued over data, struggling to maintain the discipline of evidence. The military officials asked sharper, colder questions. What is it doing here? Why now? Is it watching us? And what happens if it doesn't leave? In classified briefings, defense analysts laid out scenarios on stark slides, each one more unsettling than the last. The most benign assumed that Atlas was a passive probe, drifting aimlessly, its minor course correction a vestige of automated navigation, perhaps even accidental. In that case, humanity was little more than a bystander, a witness to alien debris. But the darker scenarios drowned out the rest. What if the probe was active reconnaissance, mapping Earth and its defenses? What if the pulses detected in the radar echoes were not idle rhythms, but encrypted telemetry being relayed to a waiting receiver somewhere beyond the stars? What if Atlas had already signaled back? Some scenarios spiraled into the realm of science fiction, yet they were written with the sober tone of military caution. Atlas might carry dormant payloads, machines waiting for activation. It might not be alone. Others could be hidden among the countless rocks and comets in the outer solar system. Its trajectory shift, subtle as it was, could be part of a pattern positioning itself for later maneuvers, or synchronizing with something else unseen. The object's silence, rather than reassuring, became ominous. Predators did not announce themselves. Civilian scientists bristled at such paranoia, warning against weaponizing conjecture. They argued that worst-case thinking risked turning a profound discovery into a spark for conflict, that interpreting every anomaly as hostile would poison any chance of peaceful understanding. But the tension between the two camps was unresolvable. For every scientist insisting that the object posed no threat, a general countered that failing to prepare for the worst would be unforgivable if danger proved real. Behind the closed doors of think tanks, theorists borrowed from history. They invoked the meeting of civilizations on Earth. Explorers and empires, ships arriving on distant shores, rarely had such encounters ended as equals. More often, one side possessed overwhelming advantage, and the other paid the price. If Atlas represented even a fragment of an advanced intelligence, the balance was not in humanity's favor. The past whispered a warning. Contact was never neutral, and so plans were drafted in secrecy. Contingencies for monitoring, for interception, even for destruction if necessary. The very notion of attempting to strike an interstellar probe bordered on absurd. Humanity lacked the technology to match its maneuverability, let alone its creators. Yet the act of planning gave officials a sense of agency, a way to push back against the vertigo of helplessness. Better to imagine a defense, however futile, than to admit that the skies had already been breached. Among the scientists, fear took a quieter form. In their private notes, some confessed a gnawing dread that the worst-case scenario was not invasion, but indifference, that Atlas might simply pass by, uninterested, its purpose inscrutable, leaving humanity forever haunted by the knowledge that it had been measured and found irrelevant. In the face of intelligence greater than their own, they wondered which was more terrifying, being targeted or being ignored. The scenarios multiplied, filling binders and encrypted drives, spilling into late-night conversations where voices dropped and eyes flicked nervously toward the ceiling. The truth was that no one knew what Atlas was, or why it had shifted course, but uncertainty was fertile ground for fear, and in the absence of answers, the human mind filled the void with its darkest imaginings. It was bound to happen. Secrecy could only hold so long under the weight of so many eyes, so many hands exchanging data across continents. The first leaks had been small technical memoranda, anonymized plots, but now, in the wake of mounting suspicion, something larger slipped free. An audio file, recorded off-console during a deep space network session. It was little more than static, punctuated by faint, rhythmic pulses, but when overlaid with commentary from the anonymous whistleblower, it became dynamite. The file appeared on a fringe forum late one night, posted under a throwaway account. At first, it drew little attention, lost among the noise of UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy chatter, but within hours, it was picked up by a more prominent blogger, one with a reputation for sniffing out hidden truths. The post framed it as the first authentic evidence of alien contact, linking it to the leaked trajectory documents already circulating. By morning, the file had gone viral, carried across social media, dissected on YouTube, debated in podcasts. Millions heard the pulses and wondered, was this the sound of something not of Earth? NASA scrambled to respond. Internally, the mood was furious. Investigations were launched, access logs combed, and staff questioned. But the damage was done. Public trust had already fractured under the strain of NASA's silence, and now the release of raw audio, however ambiguous, was seen as confirmation that something was being hidden. Denials fell flat. The more NASA insisted the sounds were routine radar echoes, the more people believed they were listening to an alien machine. Newsrooms jumped on the story with breathless urgency. Television anchors replayed the file on air, their expressions caught between skepticism and awe. Analysts were called in to speculate, some cautious, others reckless. A few scientists, weary of secrecy, began to speak more openly, confirming that the deviations were real, that international observatories had independently measured them. The whispers of conspiracy transformed into a thunder of speculation, each outlet competing to frame the narrative: discovery, cover-up, revelation. Public reaction was divided, almost violently so. For some, the leaks were proof of humanity's long-awaited contact, an exhilarating confirmation of cosmic company. Forums filled with excited theories, artwork, even prayers, imagining what the object might be and who might have sent it. For others, it was a nightmare come true, evidence of a lurking presence that governments had tried and failed to keep hidden. Fear mingled with anger, and street protests erupted in some cities, fueled by demands for transparency. Governments struggled to contain the surge. The US administration issued a carefully worded statement, acknowledging anomalous measurements, but urging calm, emphasizing that no threat had been identified. European officials echoed the sentiment, while China's state media released editorials openly accusing the West of hiding discoveries for decades. The object in the sky had suddenly become a stage for geopolitical rivalry, each nation eager to claim authority over the narrative. Meanwhile, the internet fractured into warring camps. Hashtags trended daily: number Atlas probe, number alien whispers, number cover-up. Live streams attracted hundreds of thousands of viewers, as amateur astronomers pointed their telescopes skyward, chasing the faint streak of light across the stars. The audio file was remixed into music, into memes, into art. What had once been confined to war rooms and encrypted emails was now woven into the fabric of popular culture. Atlas was no longer just an object, it was a phenomenon, an idea that belonged to everyone. For the scientists closest to the truth, the leaks brought both relief and dread. Relief that the burden of secrecy had lifted, that the world was finally grappling with the anomaly. Dread because the story was now out of their control, shaped not by careful evidence but by emotion, fear, and imagination. What they had hoped to study quietly had erupted into the loudest conversation humanity had ever had about its place in the cosmos. The leak had opened the door wide, and there was no closing it. Atlas's silence was broken, not by any signal it sent, but by the voices of billions below, each one straining to understand what its presence meant. Once the leak spread beyond containment, the story of 3I divided by Atlas ceased to be only a matter of science or defense. It became something else entirely, an idea that seeped into culture, religion, politics, and art, reverberating across the globe in ways no agency could have predicted. What had begun as a faint anomaly in the deep sky was now reshaping the way humanity thought of itself. Late-night talk shows pounced first. Comedians joked about aliens double-parking their probe in the solar system, about Earth receiving a cosmic inspection. The audience laughed, but beneath the humor there was unease, a nervous energy that pulsed through every punchline. News outlets devoted primetime slots to panels of experts, some sober, some sensational, their voices overlapping as they argued whether Atlas was rock, craft, or something in between. Ratings soared, people could not look away. In religious communities, interpretations splintered. Some leaders proclaimed the anomaly as proof of divine creation, a sign that humanity's uniqueness was confirmed by the arrival of others. Others warned of deception, casting Atlas as a test or even a threat woven into prophecy. Pilgrimages were organized, vigils held under the night sky, prayers lifted toward the faint point of light that had become a cosmic mirror for human faith. For every hopeful sermon that welcomed visitors as brothers, there was a darker one that cautioned against beings masquerading as saviors. Artists, too, found themselves galvanized. Murals appeared overnight in city streets, depicting Atlas as a silver shard piercing the heavens, as an eye watching Earth, as a messenger wrapped in shadow. Musicians sampled the leaked radar pulses, weaving them into haunting compositions that trended across streaming platforms. Filmmakers rushed scripts into production, studios racing to be the first to dramatize the unfolding mystery. Atlas became myth before the data had even settled, a canvas for humanity's most primal hopes and fears. Even academia was swept up. Philosophers convened symposia on the meaning of contact, debating whether intelligence beyond Earth would erase or affirm humanity's place in the cosmos. Sociologists studied online communities that had sprung up around Atlas, watching as belief systems crystallized in real time. Political scientists warned that nations might seize on the phenomenon to justify budgets, policies, or even power grabs. The object in the sky was no longer just an object, it was a force reshaping the structures of human society. On the streets, the reactions were more visceral. In some cities, crowds gathered with telescopes and binoculars, cheering each night as they tracked Atlas's faint glimmer. Elsewhere, fear dominated panic buying, rumors of imminent catastrophe, conspiracy-fueled protests demanding full disclosure. In one country, a cult declared the object a herald of apocalypse and retreated into the wilderness, awaiting what they believed would be the end of days. In another, schoolchildren painted Atlas in classrooms, their teachers explaining that they might be witnessing history's most important moment. For NASA, the cultural storm was both relief and nightmare. Relief, because the burden of silence had ended and the responsibility was now shared. Nightmare, because control had slipped away entirely. The agency found itself dragged into a global conversation it could not shape, its cautious statements drowned out by louder voices. Every word, every hesitation, was dissected for hidden meaning. The scientists who had once been guardians of data were now unwilling celebrities, their names trending alongside actors and politicians. The reverberations only grew louder as the days passed. Atlas, silent and distant, had become the loudest presence on Earth. It had entered not just telescopes and radar dishes, but imaginations, hearts, and fears. Humanity was no longer simply observing an interstellar object. It was defining itself in response to it. And in that response, the deepest truth became clear. Contact was not something that happened to a single agency or even a single nation. Contact was happening to everyone, all at once. As the weeks stretched on, and the furor of leaks and debates began to settle into a strange new normal, one truth remained fixed above all others. Divided by Atlas had shifted its path, and in doing so, it had shifted the trajectory of human thought. Yet as scientists refined their models, as governments argued over disclosure, as artists and preachers wove it into the fabric of culture, a question lingered with an unease that no equation could dispel. If Atlas had indeed maneuvered, if it had corrected its course like a guided probe, then what or who had it been listening to? The object itself remained silent, indifferent to the storm of meaning it had unleashed. It neither transmitted nor broadcast, never lit up with the unmistakable signature of communication. Its radar echoes carried rhythms, yes, but rhythms that could just as easily be coincidence or structure as intention. And yet the precision of its turn haunted everyone who gazed at the trajectory plots. Objects did not adjust themselves. Something had directed it, either from within or from far beyond. The unsettling possibility emerged in quiet conversations among astronomers and defense analysts alike. Perhaps Atlas had not been reacting to Earth at all. Perhaps its maneuver had been in response to something else, a signal we had not detected, a call answered not to us but to an origin point in the stars. In that case, humanity was not the focus of its attention, merely the bystander who had noticed the ripple. The thought chilled and consoled in equal measure. If Atlas was ignoring us, perhaps we were safe. If it was obeying another call, then we were watching a dialogue not meant for our ears. For others, the darker suspicion refused to fade. What if Atlas had been listening to us, not through the clumsy radar pings we bounced off it, but through the decades of signals Earth had been pouring into space? Radio, television, military radar, the voices of humanity leaking into the void since the 20th century. Perhaps the course correction was not a random adjustment, but a response to something it had finally heard, a confirmation of our presence, a decision made in silence. In that light, its new trajectory was not abstract at all. It was a gesture, a sign that it had acknowledged us. The question split the world. Optimists clung to the hope that Atlas was a messenger, perhaps even a scout sent to make first contact. They imagined a future where the silence finally broke into dialogue, where the whispers became words, where humanity joined a larger conversation. Skeptics countered that such dreams were childish, that contact with a superior intelligence was more likely to render humanity powerless than enlightened. Between these poles stretched a vast middle ground of uncertainty, where wonder and dread mingled in every heart. In classrooms, children raised their hands to ask teachers, "What do they want?" Politicians avoided the word "they" entirely, insisting on neutral phrases like the object or the anomaly. Scientists, for all their caution, could not help but feel the weight of the question pressing against their discipline, threatening to topple the fragile wall between data and speculation. Every night, as telescopes tracked Atlas's faint light slipping deeper into the solar system, the silence between its movements seemed louder than the pulses in its radar echoes. The unsettling question, who was it listening to, was one that could not be answered. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But it had already changed humanity, forcing it to confront its place in the cosmos not as an isolated island but as a participant in a larger hidden story. Whether Atlas was rock or probe, machine or messenger, it had forced open a door in the human mind that could never again be closed. And so, as the object drifted outward on its new trajectory, carrying with it the secrets of its origin and purpose, humanity was left staring into the stars with a mixture of awe and unease. For the first time in history, the silence of the universe no longer felt empty. It felt watchful,